Welcome, everyone, to our second podcast, the Mitch and Dustin podcast.
The podcast of guys who talk about stuff they don't really know what they're talking about.
Except for today. We know what we're talking about today. Sort of.
I would say we know significantly more than the average person about what we're talking about today.
Yeah. Because there are opinions, and of course we would know our opinions better than the average person knows our opinions.
And to be fair, the average person is pretty stupid, so we probably know more than the average person about most things.
Yeah. Maybe.
But especially this.
Especially this. It's something that's deep down rooted in our beings, something that we love. Rock and roll.
I was gonna lead it up a little bit more, but that's okay. I was gonna even say that it's something that our relationship is founded upon.
Yeah. Not founded upon, but built upon. For sure. I mean, because we're cousins, so we had a relationship before this. But definitely rock and roll has increased our bond with each other. So that's definitely a truth.
Beautiful. Rock and roll is undeniably the best genre of music.
Without a doubt, I would say. And people who argue otherwise are just wrong.
Like Dustin mentioned earlier that we on this podcast talk about our opinions, but in this specific instance, we're talking about a fact.
Yeah. True matter of fact. Rock and roll is the greatest genre of music. So much so, I would argue that it's God's favorite genre of music. Specifically, the Judeo-Christian God, his favorite genre of music is the rock and roll music that emerged in the 60s and 70s.
That is an assertion. Assertion?
Yep, that is. Sure. Assertion is a word. I think assertion might be a word too. Either one. But here's my argument, right? So, when you think of God, what is his purpose?
To save us.
To save us. To save us from what?
Mortality, sin, evil.
Okay. Right. So these things that bind us somehow. So you could say that God's purpose is to bring about some sort of freedom for his people. Is that fair?
Yes.
That the end goal of religion is to have freedom?
Yeah.
Okay, and how do we achieve that freedom?
I think you're asking me a leading question, but I don't know what you want me to say.
Well, what would you say?
How do we achieve freedom?
How do we achieve that specific freedom that God is trying to bring us?
By our own action in accordance with his will in a way that produces positive consequences.
Yeah. But the reason our action allows for freedom is not by our action itself. It's due to an important principle in Christianity, right? We are saved through grace, the grace of God, the grace of Christ, right? His atonement is what allows us to act in a way we can achieve freedom. So, in other words, his grace, his mercy, his love for us, it allows us to obtain that ultimate goal of freedom. So these two principles of God, of the Judeo-Christian God, love and freedom, I would argue are the essential characteristics of the Judeo-Christian God. Okay? Now, stepping aside, when you think of rock and roll, what is the mantra of rock and roll? If you had to say that when people think of rock and roll, what do they think of?
Stick it to the man.
Okay.
Drugs, sex, rock and roll.
Yeah. Okay. Those two things, sticking it to the man and sex and drugs, right? So just looking at those on the surface level, those seem like very shallow things. But I would argue that deeper down, if you poke at the idea of sticking it to the man and the idea of having sex and doing drugs, the reasons why people desire those things, at least in the context of the 60s and 70s when rock and roll emerged, you ultimately get to the same principles. You get to the same principles of freedom and love, right? So sticking it to the man, you don't want people telling you what to do. You want to make your own decisions. You want to live your own life. Sex and drugs, I mean, there's that image of the 60s hippie, right? All you need is love, says the Beatles, right? So I agree that the actions themselves might be misguided, but the principles behind the actions are absolutely 100% corresponding to the principles, the fundamental principles of God, of freedom and love.
Well, there you go, folks. Hey, did you guys know that Dustin is getting a master's degree in philosophy?
Yeah, it's true.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. Well, that was great. I agree that God loves rock and roll. I mentioned on our last podcast that my entrance essay to BYU was on the topic of how the degradation of rock and roll music is analogous to society's decline of morals. And so I agree that I think that God loves rock and roll in the same way that he loves morality. And so he's displeased with the state of music in the modern era, just as he's displeased with the state of society's morals as a whole in the modern era.
Yeah.
Anyways, so let's talk about what you love about rock and roll. Why do you love rock and roll music?
Okay, so again, I'm going to sort of ask a question based on philosophy. Do you want a functional answer or a practical answer? Meaning, like, why do I love rock and roll in the sense, how have I come to love rock and roll? What events in my life have led up to that, or just what about rock and roll is appealing to me?
Let's start with the practical.
So, the things that are appealing to me about rock and roll are there's this mysticism, I feel like. There's this energy about rock and roll that I connect with, specifically with the guitar. It's a beautiful instrument. With the drums, when there's just crazy drum fills, or the highly reverberated snare. Oh, I just love that sound. It's just a beautiful sound to me.
Yeah, I would add to that by kind of dumping what you just said into a larger bucket, which I would call intensity. Mm-hmm. One of the things I love about rock and roll is that it's intense, man. Like, it makes you, I don't know, experience depth of something, whether it is like a shredding guitar solo that's like a little bit self-indulgent. It's extreme. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or like the amount of reverberation that is sometimes put on a snare drum in classic rock music is extreme. Yeah. And so that's one of the things that I love is intensity of lots of different things.
Yeah.
One thing that rock and roll has done for me, and like many things that I may talk about today on this podcast, I don't think it's specific to rock and roll, but I experience it the most in rock and roll music, is intensity of emotion. Rock and roll has songs that are sad, man.
Yeah.
Rock and roll has songs that are like happy and exciting, and angsty, you know? One example I want to give is Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You by Led Zeppelin. Like, you can feel the pain in that song, man. And I love that. Man. I love that rock and roll gives me intensity of different emotions. I'll keep going on intensity. The intensity of musical talent of rock and roll musicians is on full display. An example is Styx' Man in the Wilderness. At the end, Tommy Shaw hits a high note. It's just for no reason. He doesn't not singing any lyric. He just, you know what I mean? Man. And it's awesome. And I just love that part because, like, there's not very many people who could sing that vocal.
Right?
And I love the intensity of his talent.
Yeah, because clearly other genres of music can be intense, right? And so we're not like arguing that rock and roll is the only intense form of music, but it seems built in the genre of rock and roll that talent is the way to achieve that intensity. There's always a higher precedence on live performance than there is on just what you can do in the studio. It seems to be the case. But I think especially in today's music culture, so much emphasis is on just the production of it, so that you don't necessarily have to be super talented. You can fix everything in post, and you can just you can still make it sound good, but it's not a musical talent so much as it is a technological talent.
Yep, I agree with that. EDM is a good example. EDM is super high intensity. Really high energy.
I actually legitimately have discovered I love synthwave music. So like the hardcore techno. Muse's most recent album is a good example of that. I love that type of music, but I recognize the instrumentation, the talent of the actual musicianship isn't necessarily required for that, where it is in rock and roll.
Yeah, that kind of music is a skill for sure, but maybe not as much talent, if that makes sense. You can learn how to write that kind of music into a program, whereas if you're trying to play a guitar solo, you have to actually play it. You know what I mean?
Yep.
But that being said, there's lots of music that I love that's high intensity because of the talent. For example, maybe you remember, maybe you don't. What's my favorite classical piece of music? And one of my favorite pieces of music, period.
Yeah, I remember you telling me. I don't remember what it was.
It's Fugue in D minor by Bach. Is that who wrote it? I think it's Bach. Mozart? Maybe it's Mozart. One of those dudes.
I don't remember.
It's the one that goes...
It's Bach.
On the organ. Dude, yeah. But freaking the organist just shreds in that song, and it's awesome. But it's definitely not rock and roll. It could be rock and roll.
Yeah.
And then another thing I love about rock and roll that has to do with intensity is the indulgence involved in the attitude, right? We talked about the stick it to the man attitude. It's like you throw your cares to the wind and you just have this rock and roll attitude, right? Whether it's a guitar solo that's just like 2.5 minutes long for no reason, like it doesn't enhance the song necessarily. I mean, for me it does, but like
Yeah.
the artists know that there's some self-indulgence to it, but they don't care. They do it anyways. Or I just think about like the band Europe in general.
Dude,
Like
I love Europe.
all of their songs sound almost ridiculous because of the style. Because every part of the style of their music is to the extreme. The way the singer sings, the way the guitar sounds, the way the synth sounds, almost sounds like it's a joke because it's so indulgent.
Dude,
if
but
that
it's
makes
awesome.
sense.
Freaking love
But
it.
it's awesome.
The Hot
I
Rod
love that about
soundtrack is the best soundtrack to any movie.
I agree. So
I was
another
watching a live performance of Snowblind by Styx. And in it, James Young busts out. That's one of my favorite solos, I think, that he does is on Snowblind. And in the comment section, I read someone like criticized him because he was like, he thinks he's the best guitarist. Look at him. He just looks so dumb. I'm like, dude, when you're playing a solo, that's how you gotta act, man. When you're playing a guitar solo, it's your time.
A guitar
You should act that
soloist
way.
in the 70s is equivalent to a rapper in the modern era,
Sure.
where you just elevate yourself above everybody else. I'm the best.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Dustin and I first formed our band when we were, how old? 14? 15? 14? And
Right after our freshman year of high school.
I barely knew how to play the guitar. Dustin sort of taught me how to play, taught me basic scales, how like solos work and song structure and some of that kind of stuff. We tried to record an album that summer. It wasn't good, but we had a song on it called Ferrets, where it was like 10 and a half minutes long or something, 12 minutes long. And the majority of it was he and I taking turns soloing. And like, I didn't even know how to play the guitar, but I had these like 2.5 minute long solos on each of these songs, or on this song several times, because that's how you do rock and roll.
Yeah.
You know? You indulge in it.
Agreed.
Good. Another thing I love about rock and roll, besides the intensity, is rock and roll is often really meaningful. And this is another thing that's not specific to rock and roll, but I've found myself being more engaged in this process through rock and roll than other musical genres. I can pull myself into the song. I can say, man, what does this song mean to me? And what does this song mean to the artist who wrote it? There's some lyrical masterpieces. If I think about Don McLean's American Pie or Hotel California, that just have lyrics that are deep and meaningful that I can sit and listen to and think about and get involved in. That's something that I love about rock and roll.
For sure. Yeah. Again, it's not specific to rock and roll, but when you have that kind of seriousness with that intensity that we talked about, that organic intensity, it's just makes a combo that's unlike anything else.
Agreed. So tell us then, Dustin, or tell them, how do we do this on a podcast? It's not like I'm interviewing you. Let's talk about your, what did we talk about last time? The practical. So now tell us about your functional love for rock and roll.
So the reason I have come to love rock and roll, my journey in my search of good music. Most people, when they're into classic rock, it's because one or both of their parents listened to classic rock, and so like they just sort of absorbed that. But for me, it's
my dad to love me.
Yeah, it's quite different. My mom always listened to oldies, like dropping me off at school and everything. So I guess I sort of absorbed something from that, but I don't think my dad even listens to music. But as far as like rock and roll goes, neither of my parents or anyone in my family, for that matter, listened to it. And so it first started when I was 12. I got my first guitar for Christmas, and that day I worked through like half of a how to learn guitar book or whatever. The first songs I learned how to play parts of were Wild Thing and Louie Louie, because they're basically the same. The like really basic stuff. Eventually, the first full song I learned was "Smells Like Teen Spirit" by Nirvana, which is more intense, but it's still pretty simple in terms of the chord progression and the guitar solo in that song. So it was easier for me to learn. And so because I was so interested in guitar, I wanted to keep learning music. I wanted to learn the songs. And since I was in middle school, what I was listening to was like Green Day and the All American Rejects. There was this emo band, Matchbook Romance, that I was really into. And so I would want to learn all of these songs by these artists. And there is a song by Matchbook Romance called Monsters, and that song actually has a pretty good guitar solo. And so I learned it. And I remember showing it to my mom, and I was like, "Hey mom, look what I learned to do." And I remember the look on her face. She was just like she was so surprised that I did something like that on the guitar. And that sort of sparked my interest. Like, I want to learn solos. I want to learn how to be really good at guitar. And it got to a point where the current music wasn't teaching me that. And so I needed something else. I needed something to indulge with, right? And around that time, I had moved to Walla Walla, and just the people there are either into country music or classic rock. And so, of course, I'm going to hang out with the kids that are into classic rock. And so by that, I was introduced to more things. I transitioned into Bon Jovi, was my new favorite artist my freshman year of high school. Because it was sort of like, it was still classic rock, but it still had like hints of like the pop rock that was popular at the time. And so it was like a transition band, I guess. And so I learned a little more guitar. And then my junior year of high school, my parents, as a joke, they noticed I was more interested in classic rock now. And so as a joke, they gave my dad the Styx Greatest Hits album, and they gave me ABBA's Greatest Hits. And that makes me so mad to this day, but it's pretty funny.
It's really funny.
I freaking hate ABBA. But naturally, because it was a joke, of course, I still took the Styx Greatest Hits album. And that changed my course of music interest. Like, it was night and day as soon as I heard that album. I remember on the wrestling bus coming home from some match, it was late and I was like falling asleep, and I had the album. I was listening to it, and Sweet Madam Blue came on, right? And so the intro to that song is just kind of slower, more melodic, and so I was falling asleep. Oh, and then as soon as the boom, 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 I immediately woke up and I was like, what is this? This is awesome. And like from there, Styx became my favorite band, and classic rock was
and in fact,
absolutely my
there's a
favorite
physiological phenomenon named after that song called the Sweet Madam Blue Goosebumps.
Yeah, exactly.
Because when you listen to that song, you get goosebumps every time.
Every time. Oh. So, Sweet Madam Blue, man. But yeah, that's essentially my journey.
That's interesting.
It was my search for guitar licks, and then it just evolved into an appreciation for rock and roll.
Interesting that your personal development of your musical ability is directly tied in, interwoven with your eventual love for rock and roll. I feel like mine was a little bit more separate, in that I first started getting into music and interested in music in middle school. I played the trumpet in band, and I don't think that made me love music, but I learned how to read notes, And then from there, I figured out, oh, the notes on the piano are like this. I can play the piano because I can read notes. I understand how the piano works. And then I found out the same thing about the guitar and the bass guitar. And then I would learn songs, and my friends in like 7th grade would be impressed, and they'd be like, oh, Mitch can play any song on the guitar. Did you know that? But really what that meant is like I could pluck out the melody, right? So I had some musical talent, but at this point there was no particular interest in rock and roll music. It wasn't until you and I started the band that I began to get into rock and roll music. So for me, it was more that I needed the camaraderie of rock and roll music. You know, I needed the sense of identity that came from being in a band, and Dustin likes this, so I'm going to also like this, because it seemed like it was a really important part of my adolescent development, if that makes sense. And then, like I mentioned before, we tried to record an album when we were ill-prepared for it. So we had written these songs really, really, really bad. Like,
so bad.
Can't even describe how bad this thing was.
Do you have any of them?
I don't have any of the original ones. I'm sure my mom has a copy somewhere.
It's so bad.
Maybe we'll see if we can track one down and we'll put it on here for you. But hey, what was I getting at? Oh, and so we like handed out these albums to our friends, and so like immediately destroyed any credibility we were ever going to generate as musicians, right? So from then on, nobody would take us seriously. And so I kind of got teased by my friends. I had a lot of close friends, but I was like bullied a little bit about this. They would make fun of my lack of musical ability. And so I feel like at that point, because you and I had started growing closer and rock and roll became our common interest, that's where I would turn to like stick it to them and be like, screw you guys, I love rock and roll. And I'd go like take out my angst on rock and roll music. And I would want to be like those rock and roll stars because I knew I wasn't very good, but I would aspire to be. And so it became like an escape for me, a really important like thing for me to lean on when I felt inadequate about my own musical abilities and the way that other people saw those musical abilities in me. And then I just never grew out of that. So to this day, I continue to listen to rock and roll music and say like, man, I wish I wrote that song. Man, I wish I could shred like this guy shreds or sing like this guy sings, right? And it like has become a part of me in that way. And I've come to appreciate the actual music part of it as well. You know, picking out like, oh, that's a great drum fill. That's a great bass line. It's a stanky B line. That kind of thing. So really it was that you turned me on to rock and roll music at a time in my life when I was really vulnerable and perceptive to something that I could hang on to.
Right. I want to appreciate the fact that I turned you on.
Yeah, you still turn me on. Yeah, really interesting. So interesting to also contrast, we've talked a few times throughout this podcast, the similarities or differences between rock music and other forms of music. I think one way that helps me kind of categorize musicians and songs is to think about it on two dimensions. So maybe we can we'll put up a chart later when we edit this that'll show what I'm talking about. But if you think of a 2x2 matrix or like just a chart, on one axis, if you imagine songwriting abilities of the artist or the songwriting ability taken to write that song from bad on the bottom to good on the top. Then on the other axis, you imagine the amount of musical talent or instrumental proficiency required to play that song. So not very talented on the left, extremely talented on the right. Then you end up with these 4 quadrants where on the top left you have musicians who aren't super instrumentally proficient, but are great songwriters. And I think in rock and roll, this is people like Tom Petty. I think about people like the Cars, right? These kinds of bands where they don't just shred their instruments.
I think the Cars are good at both.
Oh, yeah?
Well, they're probably like in the middle between
okay, sure,
not so talented and musically proficient.
Fair. But
I think they're more talented than Tom Petty.
Is like they lean more on their ability to write catchy songs than they do on their ability to just shred.
Sure.
And you can think of this also in modern music. There's people like this too, right? Like Ed Sheeran. Ed Sheeran can sing, but mostly he just writes a million songs that people like.
Right.
Taylor Swift is kind of the same way.
Right.
Assuming these people write their own songs. And then you can see if you go to the bottom right quadrant, it would be people who are super musically proficient, super talented at their instruments or their vocals, but aren't as good of songwriters. I think of like Van Halen, for example. Van Halen wrote a lot of good songs, but definitely lean on David Lee Roth's vocal talent and Eddie Van Halen's guitar talent more than they do on the catchy songs.
Right. Exactly.
And then in the top right quadrant, you have bands that are both. I think of Styx. I think
Rush.
of Rush. Rush are great songwriters, but maybe on a different plane. Like, they are great songwriters in the sense that the songs they write are masterpieces, but they're not like
they're not so
publicly
catchy.
loved. Yeah.
They're not pop rock, right? They're prog rock.
Yeah, exactly.
But they're just musically complex and beautiful musically, not so much I hear it on the radio, I'm going to sing along to it.
Yeah. I try to think of modern music who falls into this right side of the chart here, who is just super musically talented. And it's hard to know. That's what frustrates me, and what makes me love rock and roll is it's hard to know who is super musically talented because the style of music drowns it out. Because everything is so overproduced. You've got auto-tune, you've got the electronic drums, electronic music. Sometimes you see somebody on a talk show, a musician who goes on a talk show, and they like do something where they have to express their vocal talent, and they're amazing. But how would you have ever known that? I think of Adam Levine, Maroon 5's frontman, lead vocalist. He's an amazing vocalist, a great singer. Yeah. But like Maroon 5 songs don't feature that. Like, he just sings pop music.
Right. I would say in this category you would have John Mayer.
Mm-hmm.
And you would have I would say Muse. I think they're very talented and they write some good songs as well.
Yeah.
But I agree that there are few who actually are both musically proficient and great songwriters. The Killers, I think I would put similar to the Cars, where they're great songwriters and musically they're better than average.
Yeah, I would agree completely with that. Where would you put Brunil?
Obviously in the top right.
If you're being serious, though. In comparison with the other amateur bands that we performed with.
I believe we wrote some great songs. We are good songwriters, I think. Musically proficient, again, I think we are pretty good, but we never practiced, we never took it serious. So we didn't have like the best equipment either to utilize to bring out our talent. So we'd probably be somewhere in the center of that chart.
Yeah, I would say middle center maybe. When I first started thinking about this, my immediate first thought was, oh, we're more musically talented than the other bands. We had people approach us at several shows and say, you guys are the best guitarists I've ever seen play live. Like, you're the best rock band I've ever seen at one of these kinds of shows. So I immediately thought, oh, we're more musically proficient. We're better guitarists. But I don't know that we are better at playing the guitar. I think we were better at writing songs that showcased the level of ability that we did have to play the guitar.
I think that's accurate.
Where we shined was really at writing interesting songs that were interesting to play, songs that were interesting to listen to, and that showcased a rock and roll style that has been dying over time, and people appreciated that it was different than what everybody else was playing. So I think our songwriting ability is what elevated us. And like you said, there were a lot of bands who did practice a lot, and that made them musically proficient. Like, their timing was right, and they had good vocalists. That's one thing that we lacked as well, was vocal talent. and so in that way they were musically proficient, but their music was just boring. They didn't have any soul, any rock and roll. So I agree with you that I think I'd put us high-ish relative to the other bands we played with on the songwriting, and probably kind of right in the middle as far as talent goes. We just knew how to showcase it. So
Yeah. That's fair.
What is the song that you have written that is the most rock and roll, that best embodies what rock and roll is and what it means?
So 3 songs come to mind. Either She-Wolf or Rock and Roll Breakfast or Down with the Devil. I probably will throw out Down with the Devil because it sort of starts off a little bit country.
It's just Southern rock, man.
I mean, yeah, it's Southern rock, but I don't know. Probably when I think of rock and roll, I think of something like Rock and Roll Breakfast. If rock and roll had a mascot, that mascot would be the band AC/DC.
Yes.
So any song by AC/DC, any song that's in the style of AC/DC is the essence of rock and roll.
Yeah, I think that in style, Rock and Roll Breakfast is probably the most rock and roll. Though She-Wolf is also very
Right.
rock and roll, but in a different way. It's very
Right.
Styx influenced.
Uh-huh.
But I would say in passion, She-Wolf is the most rock and roll of those choices because, like, dude, you were angsty, you were having feelings, and like
That's
you were
true,
just
man.
writing a song about like we're gonna tell this girl off, and
Yeah.
it was awesome. So I love that. I love that a lot.
Yeah. What about yourself?
It's tough because I suck at writing songs.
That's not true.
I'm not very rock and roll. My dad has been on a streak lately where he just roasts me for rock and roll music. What did he say? I don't remember the first thing he said, but last time we were watching your corn dog video on YouTube, and you were like,
You gotta play rock.
"You gotta
and roll
play rock
music.
and roll music whenever you're making food," and then
And
you
then I
started
play your
playing my
sissy
song.
crap.
And my
song.
dad was like, "Didn't he say he was gonna play rock and roll music on here?" So that was a burn.
Dude,
big
I
time.
legitimately love that song.
Anyways, the most rock and roll songs I've written, I can think of 2. I'm sure that there's a few that haven't ever been produced or published that were very rock and roll. One is Premeditated Justifications. Very rock and roll. Starts with a heavy rock and roll riff. It, again, is about sticking it to a girl, telling her to quit treating me bad, like that kind of attitude. So very rock and roll in that way. The 2 others that came to mind were, one, King of the Jungle.
Yep.
It's very rock and roll. And then the other is Live My Life.
Oh,
In fact, Live My Life was modeled after
Vesuvius,
Vesuvius, from, what do you call that show? The Rocker.
the rocker, man.
Yeah,
Dude,
Vesuvius. And then also Nothing But a Good Time by Poison was like the style I was going for. But I think King of the Jungle is just a masterpiece. It's more it's not just raw riffs. Like you mentioned, AC/DC would be the mascot of rock and roll. Most of their songs are heavy riffs and power chords, which is great. I love it. But King of the Jungle is a little more intricate. It has a little more influence from other bands where I'm using more complicated chord progressions and movements and things like that.
Dude, that song is, I think, your best song that you've written. But as far as your best rock and roll song, I would say "Live My Life," and that's when we closed every show with that song
And it was
just
awesome.
rocked.
Yeah, people loved it. Except this guy came up to me after a show and was like, "You sound like the singer from Ben Folds 5." And I don't even know who that is, but
I don't know who that is either.
well, good. We love
Remember
rock and roll.
that we played at a Battle of the Bands in college, and
We
one
didn't
of
win.
the critiques the judges gave us was that your harmonies, they make you sound like an 80s rock band. We're just like,
Thank you.
yeah, that's the point.
Yeah. Yeah, what the heck was that? Freaking bullcrap.
Yeah.
We went through a phase where we were so frustrated that the bands we would play with and the like semi-popular amateur bands in our college town would play like acoustical music. They'd play an acoustic guitar with a violin and one of those little box drum things.
Drum
Like the
box
drummer sits
things.
on it and he just like slaps the box. And it would make us so mad that like, why don't people get it? Like, that's not good music.
Right. Folk music, like modern folk, was like a big thing.
Yeah. I guess because it
During
was
that
easy
time.
to set up and play. If you had a good voice, it would augment that for
I think
you.
like Mumford and Sons were like really popular, so like
Yeah.
everyone was trying to copy them.
But some of the best times were playing shows, playing rock shows, because of the
times, yeah.
feeling we would get after rocking. Like, I'm sure there's just a high that comes from sharing your talent, no matter what genre of music you're playing when you go play live. But like, even if we weren't good, like, we would never know it, man, because we came down off that stage and we were pumped because we were jumping,
Yeah.
we were doing scissor kicks, you know what I mean? Crowd surfing, the whole thing, because like, that's the rock and roll attitude.
I will say do you remember Woodward Avenue?
Yeah.
So I was friends with their singer and keyboardist, and he would like always tell me like, yeah, man, it's the hardest thing. I'm trying to get my band to have as much energy as your band.
Yeah.
Because you guys just look like you're having fun, and you're entertaining to watch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We were having fun.
It's just the natural byproduct of rock and roll music. You just naturally do that.
Agreed. Except, man, I'm sure Christian had fun, but it sure was hard to get him loosey-goosey, huh?
Yeah.
Well, anyways, tell us in the comments what genre of music you love and why you love it. And if it's not rock and roll, then we're going to roast you in the comments.
Yeah. But, yeah, do you like rock and roll? Do you not like rock and roll? Are we wrong? The answer is no, but tell us your opinion. Anything else?
No.
All right, then we will sign off. Rock on.